Welcome to the Startup Field Guide, an unusual ventures podcast where we learn from the successful startup leaders of today how their companies truly found product market fit. I'm your host, Sandhya, and in every episode, I'll dive into a different aspect of early stage company building with our guests. Let's go! Our guest today is the CTO and co-founder of Webflow, Bryant Chou. Last valued at over $4 billion, Webflow has become synonymous with the no-code movement as well as the PLG revolution. Over 3.5 million creators use Webflow to build beautiful websites in a completely visual canvas. We at Unusual Ventures are also extremely happy Webflow customers. So thank you so much for joining us, Bryant.
Welcome to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's go all the way back to 2012 when you started Webflow. How did the team come together and what was your original idea?
Yeah, so I actually met Vlad, my co-founder and CEO, while we were both working at Intuit back in 2008. And, I don't know if you remember, but this is like peak Web 2.0, lean startup movement era, right? Eric Ries, all these companies were kind of trying to reignite innovation. And Vlad and I, we started working on an internal tool together at Intuit where it would essentially just be this innovation software. So it was software that we built internally to just track all the different ideas at Intuit. And eventually we productized it and then turned it actually into Intuit's first enterprise SaaS product. It was just me and Vlad. And then in that experience, I just realized how archaic building for the web was. And of course, this is back in 2009, 2010, so we've come a long way since then. But the tools that I was used to when I was developing mobile apps, either Android or iOS, they just didn't exist for the web. So I went off and left Intuit and I started my last company. And Vlad and I still stayed in touch, but Vlad came to me in late 2012, early 2013. I was like, hey, I'm starting up Webflow, and what we're going to do is try and solve the exact pain points that we struggled with when we were building at Intuit, which was going from design to production. And initially, honestly, I was like, like for someone like me and you that know how to code, this could be helpful, but I didn't see this becoming like a billion-dollar idea, I suppose. And it honestly wasn't until I met our third co-founder, Sergi, who is Vlad's brother. He hearing him talk about what he wanted Webflow to become was ultimately what really made the light bulb go off. So for context, Sergi is a designer. He has always lived in Photoshop, Illustrator. Again, this is back in like 2010 when these tools were the only thing that you could use. And
Right.
he talked about how essentially he has been disenfranchised entirely from the creation process from his designs. Like he can design it pixel perfect, but he still had to hand it off to a developer to get it built. So that's when I was like, oh, okay, so this is the vector at which we want to solve this problem. That's something that I can, throw my weight in time and energy and calories behind. So that's how we started. And my story is a little bit different than Sergi and Vlad's, but at least from my perspective, it always came from a place of, okay, this is something that needs to exist in the world because I've felt this deep pain.
Makes sense. Now, the big focus of our show is this idea of finding product market fit, right? And it always starts with that very empathetic idea of someone who has felt the pain or knows someone who has felt it. But we typically divide that journey into like rough two stages. First, okay, how strong and differentiated is this idea? Is it a good enough hypothesis? And then second, okay, who is that right desperate customer who will be our early adopter, our evangelist, who will be our loudspeaker for the message to the whole world. How did three of you approach that path to kind of finding product market fit for Webflow?
So it was not an easy journey, obviously. So when we started out, everyone around us was telling us that either it was a solved problem or the way that we wanted to go and solve the problem was going to be not good enough. So I'll give you a few examples. So um, back in 2013, Dreamweaver was still a thing. Wix and
Right.
Squarespace were still out, and Wix was already a public company. Squarespace was already off to the races, and developers, were front and center in everyone's sort of collective mind share. Like everyone was talking about how important it was to write code. This is like peak GitHub years. This is peak coding boot camp years. But we had this premise that there was it was not going to be a world of black and white where only designers design and only coders code. We essentially built the entire company on the premise that there is this middle ground where designers can code, developers can participate in the design, but the thing that is missing, the fabric that is missing, is tooling, and specifically a visual development environment where we take the foundational primitives of the web, such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we build that UI layer on top of it to make it much more accessible. And everyone around us told us this is going to be too complicated for designers to learn, and it is going to be not powerful enough for developers to actually adopt. And it's not like when we first came out of beta in August 2013 that we proved everyone wrong. It was a gradual period, I would say, over the first 5 years of the company for people to actually understand that you can do things visually to the same degree of performance, responsiveness,
Right.
and professionalism as an actual developer building it. And honestly, it wasn't until Ryan Hoover published that the rise of no code medium article that no code became a thing, and all of a sudden we became bucketed into this massive movement that is no code, where now it's well understood that there is no code software to do exactly that, which is fill this gray area between something that is very black and white, something that is only designed, something that is only for developers.
Right, right. That is such an amazing story because it's not like you started the company in 2012 saying we are going to start this flagship movement called like the
Yeah,
no
yeah,
code revolution, but that was the great narrative headline for what you were driving at the grassroots
yeah.
level. So yeah, no, I
And
love the clarity of the sequence in which those things happened, and hearing that from you.
we
So
were
going back to
yeah.
maybe, go ahead.
So the one thing is that we're extremely intentional about making sure that people understood where we were coming from. So something that we did that I don't think other companies did at the time was we went to great lengths to show that the code that Webflow would output is super clean. It's the exact same
Right.
code that a developer would write. It's like, oh wow, this is like exactly the way I would build this type of website or web page, and it's down to the last CSS line, HTML line, JavaScript. So we went to great lengths to prove to people that visual tooling such as Webflow can cross the chasm for the very technical audience.
Right. And going back to your private beta, right? You had a lot of people saying no. Who was saying yes? Like, who did you do the building with? Who are like the people who are trying out your, very, very first versions of your product and were part of your private beta? And how did you think about who the right people to get feedback from at that stage
Yeah.
was? Or rather, whose feedback was the most poignant and helpful.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that we did right in the early days. We were very selective about the market that we were going to enter and also the use cases that we were going to solve. So the
Right.
market that we were going to enter was the professional website market. So not the website builder cookie cutter template, like something my mom can use, but a professionally designed and professionally built website that typically requires a professional freelance web designer and a professional web developer to go and put together. And that's a big market actually, so like, that's essentially the most of the WordPress markets, the mid-market craft
Right.
CMS was big at the time. A lot of these products were big at the time. And the use case that we were solving for was very specific. It was actually the use case of specifically a freelance web designer, which is, someone that at the time we were brainstorming what this person would look like. This would be a freelance web designer making $40,000 a year, working out of a coffee shop, building websites for businesses of all kinds, and really struggling with the fact that they have to fork over 50% of the entire project to a web developer so that they can implement those designs. So that use case grounded us for the first, let's say, 5 or 6 years of the company, where our entire go-to-market motion, as well as our community building, and most definitely our product roadmap, was very centered around that particular persona. We gave that person a name. We had a poster of this person in our office, and that's how we kind of rooted all of our priorities in the very beginning.
Got it. What was like the first aha moment for your product? What made people's eyes light up and have them go, "Oh my God, this is so different from everything else I have used so far."
Well, I'll give you my first aha moment, which I believe was also Vlad's first aha moment. So this was like late July 2013. We're in the thick of Y Combinator. Paul Graham's telling us, hey, you guys got to launch your products by demo day and get some traction. Otherwise, you won't be able to raise any money. And we're like, oh, shoot, that's exactly what we have to do. So long nights, many weekends. And Vlad and I essentially was just coding nonstop. Sergey was designing nonstop. And I remember it was like a Thursday afternoon. Um, we had just ordered Indian food from DoorDash, which Andy Fang, one of the co-founders of DoorDash, dropped off the food because he was a driver at the time for DoorDash.
Right.
We just finished lunch and we just merged some code to production. And we're all sitting and hovering around Sergey's laptop. And we're watching Sergey design a website for the very first time in Webflow. And we saw him drag a div container onto the page. We saw him style that element. We saw him put some text on it. We saw him publish it. Literally in a matter of seconds, if not a minute, he had built a website and published it. And that was the very first time that I ever saw the circle be complete with Webflow. And that's when I knew that we've created something that was really extremely powerful. Because someone like Sergi, with no coding background, went and built a bespoke professional website that was hosted on really robust infrastructure on AWS that was performant. Um, I, I I remember having goosebumps and just talking about it right now, I still have goosebumps because that's when I knew that what we were building was special.
Right. What about kind of early customer feedback? Any surprises, anything that, either helped you gain more conviction or changed how you were thinking about the product roadmap, positioning?
The only feedback in the first 2 years of the company was we want more. We want more functionality. We want more support for
Right.
widgets and elements. We want maps. We want social widgets. We want lightboxes, carousels. And essentially, the first year, 2 years was a sprint. We designed and built features in days. We ship them sometimes in hours, like everything from some hosting feature to handle 404 redirects, or some new widget that a customer asked for, or forms. These things were like lightning fast delivery because at the time, shipping product was our only way to grow. We didn't have money to spend
Right.
on marketing. So we viewed our product development velocity as the best potion for organic growth. And I think that's true for a lot of early stage companies out there looking for product market fit. But in particular, Webflow needed to essentially unlock more of these capabilities because it just unlocked more and more visual use cases for Webflow. And by that I mean it just like gave people that didn't have that ability to code this custom lightbox the ability to now create a lightbox. So that that was a constant sprint. And it was fun, because we're just shipping product nonstop. The one thing that was also a surprise, not really a surprise, but one thing that we heard all the time was everyone was asking for a WordPress integration. And they wanted dynamic content. They wanted a blog. And at the
Right.
time, Webflow didn't have a CMS. So this is an instance where we deliberately ignored our customers. We ignored the feedback. We're like, yeah, we could go and integrate with the WordPress CMS, but we actually have ambitions for something even greater. So this is an instance where Karen Peacock at Intercom has talked about this, where customer feedback is almost superficial. You have to really engage and understand exactly what the customer needs and really go down to their root pain points before you go in action, because there's millions of data points for customer feedback. It's like, I want this, I want that. But it's often that if you really spend the time learning about your customer, you'll actually extract these themes, and these themes will lead you to create innovative products. So to go back to this WordPress integration example, the theme that we saw in all this feedback about customers asking for a WordPress plugin is that they wanted to render dynamic content on a WordPress page, or on a Webflow page, sorry. And we could have gone out and built it, but what we did was we really tried to understand, A, what does the overall market look like for the CMS? What is Webflow's right to win in the overall CMS market? And what we did was we took bold steps forward and we created essentially the world's first visual CMS back in 2015. And this was a CMS that was completely revolutionary at the time. You had the ability to create custom fields, describe relationships to data, but then most importantly, you had the ability to bind dynamic content to the UI on your Webflow site. None of this, existed at the time, and we're still the market leaders in that space. So effectively, we took that piece of customer feedback and we saw how loud it was and how fervent it was, and we've essentially birthed an entirely new CMS category out of it, which is the visual CMS category that now Webflow owns. So that was a really interesting takeaway, just dealing with not dealing with, but like just seeing all that customer sentiment and feedback pop up over the years.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, it's a very, very easy thing to say, we are customer centric. We always listen to our customers versus, yeah, like actually asking why and, heeding the need behind the ask. So I think amazing example. Thank you so much for sharing that. Maybe switching a little bit to kind of go to market. So you talked a little bit about like the first beachhead persona being this freelance designer. What did that? How did that evolve at all? Or looking at 2015, now you have shipped the CMS. Like, are content marketers also like a target persona? How did you guys think about like, okay, who's our customer? 3 years into starting the company?
Yeah, so I think I talked about how this freelance web designer was our initial beachhead persona, and it works really well because the company needed to focus. So soon
Right.
after that, let's say 3 or 4 years in, we suddenly realized that they're just one stakeholder in the entire website creation process. Ultimately, these freelance web designers, they're building websites for end businesses, so firms like Unusual Ventures or restaurants down the street. And for us, we probably ignored that segment of the market for a little bit too long because we started to realize that Webflow, the tool, was really, really good at going from 0 to 1, going from an idea and a design and
Right.
launching it. But that's just a fraction or a tiny fraction of the overall life cycle of a website. After you launch the website, you got to maintain it. You got to update content. You got to write your blog posts. You have to work on your SEO. You have to drive traffic to it. So, as our initial beachhead persona was really solidified, that's when we really had to invest go to market and product marketing energy specifically into understanding all the different stakeholders in a Webflow project. So now I could probably name 7 different persona types that we use on a day-to-day basis at the company now. And sure, we have our top ones, right? And uh, we we are still sort of like very cognizant of the fact that our space is very multifaceted and we have to talk to all these different personas now, especially as the company's grown, as the product's grown, we have to keep all of them into account.
Makes sense. Um, so, shifting gears a little bit to your role in the company, I think you've been the CTO, but also focused on growth and kind of played the role of growth leader at Webflow. And so, I'm so curious, how did your role evolve as the company grew? And what were some of the kind of early days of building that, very bottom up growth motion at Webflow? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, I would say all of the founders were growth oriented, right? We struggled to raise money for our seed round. We we knew that what we were building needed to attract the attention of very discerning eyes, specifically developers' eyes. So every single one of us, Vlad, Sergey, and myself, we obsessed over the copy of our website, not just the design. We obsessed over the architecture of our website. We obsessed over which sections of the website should be displayed over others. We obsessed over everything, down to the first blog post that we're going to write. I remember it taking us like 8 months for us to write our first company blog post because we just didn't really know exactly where to kind of really drive that narrative. And
Right.
I would say that that is probably a healthy dynamic when you are resource constrained. And for a very long time, Webflow was bootstrapped. It wasn't until Excel led our Series A that we had serious, cash to use. So essentially, for 6 years of the company, we were just growing the company off of revenue. So what that meant was, when I was the head of growth at the time, it was all about being extremely scrappy with where to find that top of funnel, where to find the retention, and where to optimize monetization. So the natural decision for us at the time when I started to focus on growth was, hey, like we know at a certain point organic is going to trail off, right? No companies just grow completely off of organic unless you're like a pure B2C product, something like a Notion or something like that, um, with a massive TAM. So that's when, I started to think about growth engineering. So specifically, what are some of the products that we can release that can help with top of funnel awareness. That's when we started to think about how marketing could be an extension of products. So um, we created things like flexboxgame.com, which was essentially a game of Froggy, but it was implemented in the Webflow designer that people used, and you have to like use Webflow Flexbox in order to progress through the game. So we had to just be extremely creative. We had to think about how to use organics and virality to help drive the company. And that's also when we also started to experiment with performance marketing as well, content marketing, affiliates, influencers. So fun facts, there is an influencer out there and he's responsible for probably tens of thousands of Webflow customers. And not only that, he's probably also responsible for really help solidifying Webflow's brand in the design world as well. So all of these things were started as experiments. And essentially when I was running growth at the time, I would think of it as an engineering pod. I would think of it as, all right, what is the impact, confidence, and effort out of all this backlog of growth ideas? We'd meet weekly, we'd score them, we'd throw new ideas on there, and we would just find really scrappy ways of working through that backlog. And some of them hit, some of them didn't, but for the ones that hit, they became extremely impactful.
And one of the complaints I often hear from earlier stage founders is, well, we don't have enough quote unquote like traffic or audience to really like run a well-defined experiment. So obviously like the size of potential impact and the size of the ideas have to be really big so that you can quickly get a yes or no. How did you think about that at the very early stage? Like what does a good experiment idea look like and how quickly did you move on it?
Um, Probably as a former exec at Amplitude, you won't like this answer, but we didn't experiment. What we did was we built and refined our conviction around certain things, and we just swung hard.
Right.
We didn't wait for static. We didn't define a very clean A/B or multivariate experiment simply because we're not a product or company that has that type of traffic. Airbnb can experiment with 1,000 different variables simultaneously. For a company like Webflow that's B2B to C, we have to be very selective about when we choose to experiment. And when we do, we are very deliberate about how we run them. But at least in the early days, when we're looking for product market fit, it started with deep conviction about the problem that we're solving. And it started with our belief that we were the users that we're primarily building this product for. Sergi is the primary user of this product. So whenever there was a product or feature that needed to be built, it was like, does Sergi need this? Does our target persona need this? Out of all these things that they need, where does it rank? How do we get it out there? Because it's not just once you build it, they'll come, but you have to think about ways of distribution at the same time, right? So you have to think about the entire life cycle of the product, not just the innovation stage, but also the distribution stage when you're pre-product market fit, because you really, really want to invest those limited resources in a way that's just going to have the most impact when you don't have the benefit of law of large numbers to help you incrementally experiment towards it. Um, that was one thing that was the only way that we could actually progress in the early years.
I actually love that answer, even as a former Amplitude executive, because we spent a lot of our time educating people on like how to think about the right type of experiment for the stage and business model they have. And this was by far the easiest mistake to make, which is when you are a very early stage startup, even when you are a B2C early stage startup and you don't really have a lot of traffic, like your ideas have to be big swings so that you can get a clear signal, right? Like five people who are crazy about something you just did is a clear signal. if the idea is big enough and kind of as a swing has to be big, as opposed to like, oh, this button has square edges instead of round. Like it literally would not matter until you have millions of people with an opinion, and maybe you get like a 0.3% lift that matters. Like as a startup, none of that. Statsig is not really a part of the vocabulary. It's the idea that matters.
One of,
Um,
yeah.
I'm I'm curious, like how did you build the team? Like what was the talent you looked for as you continued to grow a growth focused team?
That's a great question. There's two dimensions that I use to kind of evaluate people, especially in the early stage. The first one is the ability to discern what is important to work on and what is not. That by far is the number one quality to look for if you are hiring someone in a decision-making role, whether it's your first product manager, your first engineering leader, your first leaders, or even your first lead engineers. You want to be able to start thinking about how you layer in a organizational hierarchy where the founders are not going to be a bottleneck for decision making. And in order for that to happen, you need to look for people that ultimately just know what's important and know what's not. So that is by far the biggest factor when thinking about growing a growth team, which is if you have a growth PM that is not, well, sorry, not a growth PM. If you have leaders in the company, I don't want to like typecast just the growth PMs. If you have leaders in the company that have the inability to create that distinction and clarity for the rest of the team, you're just going to be focusing on the wrong thing. And it's just so important to have focus in the early days. The other dimension, and it doesn't have to exist in the same person, is simply just raw agility and execution power. Like when you are cash strapped, when you're ticking against time, when you're going against big incumbents, your true angle here is speed. And speed typically comes off with certain trade-offs. So it will come off with the trade-off in quality maybe, or trade-off in performance. And if you're building a product like Webflow, you need it to be performant. You need it to be extremely high quality. So that has been something that's been really difficult to find at Webflow because we want to find people with the right craft, but we also need to find people with the right amount of urgency. And especially in the early days, we sought to build people, we sought to bring on people with that sense of urgency in areas that we knew where we could move faster. So areas like content marketing, performance marketing, these are things that, should already have a good degree of agility built in already. But for certain things that needed to be done really well, such as designing the Webflow designer, really thinking about how a product or a feature should work, especially when there's no historical precedent for building something like Webflow before. That's where we took our time. So it was always a delicate trade-off there. And generally, I think when founders are thinking about building out those layers of organizational hierarchy, the one thing that I always tell people is like make sure you screen for people that really understand your customers, really understand the product, really understand the problem that you're solving, because those are the ingredients that give those people the context needed to discern what is important and what is not.
Makes sense. Very well said. And as the head of growth, how did you think about CAC LTV for Webflow, right? You had a lot of smaller customers that, were lower ACV compared to especially kind of traditional enterprise software, which has, a sales team trying to get like minimum, 30K ACV. So you had a very different model. How did you think about customer acquisition and what to spend money on versus, not?
It's a great question because back in 2015, 2016, we were operating the company probably the way you should operate it in 2022 and 2023, which is very cash efficient, right? Like, I think a lot of the
Yeah,
companies back in 2014, 2015, terrible unit economics, right? Like, I heard that Instacart was burning $14 per order, right? Like, that was simply not us since like we just never had the fundraising profile to go out and deploy irrational amounts of cash for the sake of market expansion or customer acquisition. So to be honest with you, we didn't use LTV CAC. What we used was essentially payback period, and then we essentially would always have a fine eye towards literally our net income, because our net income was our growth bucket. Our net income is where we would pull resources from when we uh, went to go do customer acquisition, let's say in performance marketing or
right.
something like that. So, the kind of way we were running the company back in 2015 and 16 is probably the way that a lot of SaaS companies should be thinking about their financials and their unit economics today. But it's probably going to be really, really hard for companies to do that, especially when we've had a decade of just opulence and just free cash. So, LTV CAC for us was always extremely healthy because we always had a very, very organic led business. Word of mouth was always very strong for us. Not only that, because of our business model of going after freelance web designers, they were effectively our sales channel. They were our part.
Right.
They essentially operated as our extension of our Webflow's marketing and sales. So every single freelance web designer that we converted as a customer, they would have to go and find business for themselves to go build websites on top of. So that was an economically efficient way for us to grow at scale, especially in the early days.
And how do you think Webflow's future looks different from its past at this point? Like every company like yours eventually goes up market. What does that conversation and those trade-offs sound like within Webflow?
Yeah, so we have two core focus areas. So the first one is that we want to be the de facto standard for the way professionals build for the web. And I use the word professionals because we're not going up against Wix and Squarespace where they're just selling to mom and pop shops, right? We want to be the standard for the way professionals design and build and launch professional websites. So these are websites that generate leads for businesses. These are websites that distinguish brands from one another. These are websites that are multinational, multilingual. Um, these are websites that sell goods and services. So we want to essentially continue to be the market leader in that particular segment of the website category. And then that means that we have to invest in the product in certain ways to continue to be the market leader there. And then obviously, we have started a sales motion about 2 years ago at Webflow, and that's also going to be extremely important. And the size of that market is massive, right? We still run up with enterprise customers that are spending millions of dollars a year on some very antiquated Adobe technology that they don't even have the ability to build and support anymore. And Webflow really is a completely different type of offering in that it's managed. It's a modern technology stack. It has the flexibility. It has the customizability. And we're just getting started there. So what that means is that we also have to invest in our product ways of servicing larger companies. And thankfully, a lot of the products and features that we do need to build there for the larger audience, our SMBs and freelancers also need, because they need collaboration, they need multi-language, things like that. So thankfully, the product roadmap has a high degree of overlap when we're thinking about these disparate segments of the market. And wherever possible, we're thinking about ways of beefing up our products to really excel at both. It's a trade-off, right? Because it almost feels like you're driving a car with two accelerator pedals at the same time. but I think we're getting really good at modulating how we're thinking about our investments now.
Got it. And how have you invested in your own evolution, especially as you have, played different roles, worn different hats within Webflow? How have you learned and grown as a founder? Something that stands out for you in the past few years as being super formative?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between myself 6 years ago and today is I have a family now, two young kids, and they give me a tremendous amount of perspective. And honestly, they're by far the most important aspect of my life and existence. So, thinking with that perspective in mind, I approach myself as a leader as like, hey, like going to work every day, having the ability to work with incredible people that are super talented, so smart, and so bought into Webflow's mission, that in and of itself is a tremendous gift. And maybe in the past when I would be anxious or um, antsy or defeatist about certain things that would happen at work. Having that sense of balance now is very important because maybe in times where I was super anxious about something that would happen, whether it be a delay or a competitor or something like that. I suppose I'm reminded that there's more things to life than just work, and I think having that healthy balance has been a big part of my growth as a leader and as a founder here. Um, you know, I have to say that I've also introduced a good amount of personal time in my schedule somehow, where my wife allows me to go pursue new hobbies, new things, and cultivate friendships that maybe 4 or 5 years ago I didn't have the time for because I was working all the time. So I think there's a time and place for people to really just focus on what they're trying to do at work. Um, but I think in the grand scheme of things, you have to ask yourself, hey, if you're 70 years old, 80 years old, and you don't have the physical, mental, or familial relationships that you used to have, like, what do you really have? Like, what were you really spending all that time on at work? So um, I've always kind of operated with this subtle fear of death. And I think the past few years has given me just a lot more uh, perspective that work is extremely important. This deal that we're working on, this product that we're trying to ship, but ultimately, I think I don't let it come in conflict with my personal and emotional health. And I think that's something that I think is easy to forget when you're younger, but especially as you get older, you realize how truly short your time is on Earth.
Yeah, definitely makes you more patient pretty much immediately. Right?
Totally, totally.
And what would be your advice for seed stage founders getting started right now? Like any if you look back to 2012, what do you remember kind of doing well that you feel like people might have lost a little bit of today, or things that you would have done differently? I would love to hear some.
I think the biggest difference between, let's say, 2012 and 2022 is it feels like there are way more problems to solve and a lot more variety in terms of how you would solve them. The rise of AI, the importance of climate, the importance of sustainability, the rise of automation. There's so many things now that are so big, right? Like I still feel like websites is a massive market, and there's so many problems to solve in the web space. But for people that are thinking about starting a company, there is just so much more surface area that so many more interesting problems to solve, so many interesting investors like yourself that are interested in funding those entrepreneurs. So, given that, if I was 27 again, I would be really thinking about how to surround myself with people that can give you as much inspiration, knowledge, and and yeah, inspiration and knowledge to help you understand what is the number one problem for you to go out and solve.
Right.
Because there's so many now. And I think that's a very luxurious time to be an entrepreneur now because so many things have been opened up with software. And I think software has really eaten the world. And I think there's still so many industries that need to be optimized. There's so many big problems that need to be solved across climate, across sustainability, across ag tech, fintech, that I think the best thing that I would tell my kids if they were thinking about exploring entrepreneurship or just in general is just find those 5 people that you want to be super close to in life and make sure that they are the people that are opening up your eyes to the world and perking up your ears. Because at least for me, I'm not someone that just goes and locks myself away and reads 100 books a year. I'm someone that draws inspiration from others. And a lot of that comes from the friends that I have, the conversations that I have with them. And I think that's something that anyone should be thinking about.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show, Brian. This was incredible. Can't wait to release this interview. And very, very happy to be investors in Webflow and be able to share all of your learnings and wisdom from building such an amazing company with all of our listeners. Thank you so much.
Awesome. This was really fun. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Startup Field Guide with Sandhya, an Unusual Ventures podcast. Stay connected with us by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you liked what you heard, please rate our show and help us reach more aspiring founders with lessons on how to find product market fit. Thanks for listening. Until next time.